Welcome to World at Work TV. I'm Marsha Rhodes. Today we're exploring the premise that everything we do in compensation is communication. And with me is Ann Bars, Managing Partner of Altura Consulting Group and the force behind Compensation Force and Compensation Cafe. Ann, how did you come to the conclusion that everything we do in compensation is communication?
Well, I really grew up with the discover, design, deliver method of compensation, which taught me that, or which I learned that was where we communicated after we designed a program. But my practical experience really over the years has taught me differently. You're really realizing finally that compensation is an important communication tool and that we are sending messages inadvertently and unintended sometimes, but with every element of compensation and through all the process of designing and implementing plans. What I've learned really is that we are communicating through the whole process and not just at the end when we're ready to roll it out to employees.
What are some examples of things that we do in compensation that we don't think of as communication but are in fact sending messages to employees and managers?
For one thing, I think the communication process actually starts before design in the direction setting stage. And I think that that's the point where we define the problem we're trying to tackle and that we start to describe the solution we think we're after. I could illustrate that with the example of a client organization I worked with where we were given a board directive about putting productivity incentives in place for their staff. They were facing, as an organization, some issues around productivity that were actually threatening the financial viability of the company. The board directive came down to put incentives in place to try to raise productivity. And as part of doing that, though, and despite the fact that there was a real sense of urgency in moving forward, we did stop and take the time to have some employee focus groups and to talk directly to employees about productivity and their perspectives on it. What we discovered through that process was that the employees actually did understand how important productivity was and were very personally motivated to be productive in their jobs, but that the organization was thwarting their efforts through a number of things, through structure, through how their jobs were designed, through processes that were in place. And these things were getting in the way of productivity more than anything. That discovery was an important part of the communication and messaging in that compensation plan. If we had gone forward and designed a compensation or incentive plan around productivity incentives where we did it as we exactly initially envisioned, the message to these employees would have been from the organization, number one, we don't think you care very much about productivity. Number two, we don't think you understand how important it is. And given the struggles the employees were facing and how motivated they actually were, I think that would have been a really insulting message for the employees, and it would have probably doomed the incentive to not working very well for the organization in the long term. So that's one example where the communication process and the messaging process really has to start even before design. And certainly in the design itself, I think it's also important that we think about design as a communication vehicle, and an easy example of that would be incentive plans. When we choose performance measures for incentive plans, those measures and the choice of those measures sends a strong message about what is and isn't important to employees who participate.
That's a great scenario of how thinking about communication early on in the process prevented problems from happening.
Absolutely. So I think if we had been just focused on design, we could have really backed ourselves into an unhappy corner.
And speaking of unhappy corners, what risks do we run in compensation when we realize that things that we're doing are actually communication?
The biggest risk we run is conflicting messages. We may say through our corporate communication efforts, for example, that teamwork and collaboration are very important parts of the company culture, while our reward programs may be focused entirely on rewarding individual efforts and achievements. So on the one hand, we're saying work together, that's really important. On the other hand, what employees see is that those people who are out for themselves are the ones that get rewarded. So I think it's conflicting messages that we have to be careful of and just be aware of, so that we know what messages the compensation plan is sending, and we're cognizant of that as part of the design.
Yes, it's really tough when companies send conflicting messages, especially when it speaks to the values that they're trying to espouse.
Yes, absolutely. And I've run into situations where that's been true, where the values, there'll be a set of values and they're documented and they're on the website that say one thing, but then the people and the efforts that get rewarded say something different and really fly in the face of those values in some cases. That really speaks to us being ahead of the game and paying attention to messages and communication before or during the design process so that we don't get to the point of communicating it and realize we have those disconnects.
You did some informal research on what people think about their pay. What did you learn?
One thing the respondents told us was that we're pretty good at communicating the basic mechanics of pay, how the programs work and how they operate. We're not so good, not as successful at communicating the link between pay and business results or business strategy. I think that's certainly an area where the respondents pointed to an opportunity for us to improve. Another thing we found through the survey too was that we're poor at following up on communication, particularly compensation communication, in that we don't check back with employees to see whether the communication was clear, whether it was understood, and whether we really sent the message we intended to.
And in closing, if everything we do in compensation is communication, what advice do you have for reward professionals on how to better manage the messages that their compensation programs are sending?
One piece of advice I guess I'd share with my fellow reward professionals is the importance of testing. I think most of us, when we can, do test changes to or new compensation programs before we roll them out, and we test them for clarity and for viability and just make sure that people understand the program. But testing is also a great opportunity to check the messaging and to see what employees are reading into a compensation program. I find it a really critical piece for that whole, compensation is communication thought process, a good place to check in with employees. And I'll often ask the question point blank, what message do you think this pay plan is sending? Or what message do you think it's going to send to your fellow employees? And then try to gauge their answer. Do they think the message makes sense? Does it resonate with them? Does it seem appropriate? Do they regard it positively or negatively? Does it upset them? Is there something about that they find unsatisfactory or upsetting? These are important things to know, and without asking employees and getting that gauge before we roll out the program, we're really at risk for those inconsistent messages, and talking out of both sides of our face because we don't fully understand how employees are going to read the programs that we send out.
Ann Bars, Managing Partner of Altura Consulting Group, thanks for joining us. For World at Work, I'm Marsha Rhodes.